You're listening to the Perth Property Show, Australia's only weekly property podcast by West Australian experts for West Australian listeners. Catch your latest episode every Monday at 7 a.m.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Perth Property Show. My name's Trent Fleskens, your host as always. And finally, in the middle of March, we have just ticked over 3,000 properties on the market. We didn't think it would take this long, but we finally have, which is a positive for the direction of mobility. Without a doubt, we are still in a space of chronic undersupply, like essentially we've never seen before. And statistically, as we've never seen before, we're still in that space. We haven't left it yet, but what we do know is we've hit a milestone that we haven't seen for 17 weeks. We're going in the right direction. You'd also realize your mortgage has started to tick up with the interest rate rise that came in on the back of the Iran war and the issues coming out of the Strait of Hormuz. That's essentially a great little excuse for Michelle Bullock to deflect the blame and take the heat off her on something she was probably going to do anyway. And what happens when interest rates rise in undersupplied markets where there is still some fat in the affordability index, which is the reality for Perth, not for Sydney, is that it doesn't change the course of growth. We will still see growth. It'll just be slower than we thought it was going to be until things calm down, until rates drop again, because what it does, it dampens the serviceability, the propensity to lend of those people on the fringes, on the edges of their debt to income ratio. So our average in Western Australia being 4.5 to 1 means we've got fat, but those at the 6 now won't be able to offer what they would have wanted to, which therefore reduces the heat in the market in some of those properties and some of those markets. And again, you look at Sydney, for example, they're way over their affordability index theoretical cap. And so every time we see interest rate rises from now on, what we expect to see is actually negative growth. So that's the difference in dynamics of Sydney versus Perth. And it's good to be able to have another chat on a suburb update with one of the suburbs we haven't spoken about for 6.5 years now. It's a perfect bookend again on how the market's been going since pre-COVID to now. And again, there is only one man to speak to. We spoke to him 6.5 years ago on this podcast. He was the number one agent in the suburb in November 2019. He's still the number one agent in the suburb in March 2026. It's Matthew Jones. How you going, mate?
Going well, Trent. Thanks for having me back. It's been a while.
It's certainly been a while, and it's certainly been a journey for Carlisle, which is one of those middle suburbs in Perth. Your everyman suburb, isn't it?
Yep.
Back in 2019, the median house price was pretty much bang on with the Perth median house price, just above $500,000, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Back then it was $505,000, and it's seen a pretty sharp increase since then.
And what is it now?
So now we're at 923,000, which is virtually double, not quite there, but it's been a big jump.
So Carlisle really just, as I said, an everyman suburb, the median suburb in Perth, has tracked Perth's median house price growth from around 500 to around 900 in the last 6 years very closely, hasn't it?
It's an interesting one with Carlisle because with the median, it belies like what some of the sales that have taken place in the area, and there is some big numbers floating through the suburb now and some bigger sort of price points with larger family homes. The median still holds at 923 just based on, because it is a diverse suburb, of course, and there is going to be those lower price points and higher. But yeah, it's certainly trending upwards for sure.
It's probably worth having a quick recap on Carlisle itself and the offerings. Since we spoke, we've had West Coast Eagles move in down the road in Lathlane on the other side of Roberts Road, which is the boundary between Lathlane and Carlisle, isn't it?
Correct, yeah.
And the interesting point I remember about Carlisle that I'll never forget, to be frank, is the theme.
That's it.
The streets are very unique, aren't they?
They are indeed. Yeah, that astrology-based names, and they're still there today, and it's still, very distinct to the area for sure. Apollo Way, Solar Way, Asteroid, Star, Mars, the list goes on, really.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the fun things about Carlisle. There's plenty of suburbs around WA that have themes. Heathridge, for example, you've got the nautical theme, and Beachborough's got the native flowers theme. But I think it's really cool to have that one.
Yeah, those names have always been synonymous with Carlisle, and they are pretty cool. Solar Way, like I said, and things like that. So they sound really good, and people tend to enjoy that side of it.
It's very much an avenue suburb, isn't it? Some very long streets and a very metric system, which is a little different compared to the suburbs you've seen in the 80s and 90s, a lot of cul-de-sacs and bends and tracking undulating hills, for example. But Carlisle is a flat suburb and it's a metric system, isn't it?
So it is like a grid, particularly from Star Street up to Rutland Avenue. So you're going to get Star Street, Mars, Planet, Bishopsgate, Raleigh, Jupiter, Rutland. It's in that line that goes up. And then from Star Street back to Orrong Road, it gets a little bit more different. There's some cul-de-sacs and whatnot. O'Day Street's a very popular one. Poultridge Avenue, Solar Way is a loop road. So there is a little bit, if you look at it as a half, like going towards Orrong, it breaks up a little bit with cul-de-sacs and whatnot. And then it's very much a grid formation going back to Rutland Avenue.
I bet that would be the delineation on the land subdivision that was done decades ago as well.
You would say so, definitely. Yep.
What's the more expensive bit of Carlisle and what's the cheaper bit?
The suburb as a whole has really moved forward. Traditionally, you'd always talk about the top end of the suburb being the higher price point. So the top end of the suburb might be, traditionally, it's Archer Street to Roberts, which is right on the Lathlane border. There's also along Western Street and O'Day Street. So it's still that kind of Lathlane end of the border is traditionally the higher price points. But ironically, the bigger numbers that have been coming have been down the traditionally called the bottom end of the suburb.
The industrial end.
Yeah, there's been some big numbers down that end, which has pointed to a bit of a resurgence of the suburb down that end as a whole.
Why would I want to live in Carlisle?
Proximity to the CBD for starters, you're only 6 or 7 Ks away. And then, but it's your transport links are just hard to be beaten, really. You've got Carlisle and Oat Street train stations, which is obviously with the Metronet rail line just opened up. Vic Park Cafe Strip's only minutes away. You've got Crown is close by, Optus Stadium, the airports are close by as well. So really just the ability to get around the city and the metro areas is unmatched in some regards. Yeah, it's a very convenient suburb.
Where am I going to school if I'm a kid growing up in Carlisle?
Lathlane Primary School is probably a very popular one for people in Carlisle. Also East Vic Park Primary School. So they're probably the two predominant ones. There is Carlisle Primary School, which is ironically across Orrong Road and not actually in Carlisle. But I would say that Lathlane and East Vic Park are probably your primary schools. And then when it comes to high schools, West Lafrane Catholic College is pretty popular. There's also Kent Street High School as the sort of public one. And then we're not that far from the city. So I guess if people want to get to private tuition and whatnot, there are options.
You got Trinity Mercedes, a lot of kids in wearing that uniform.
Correct, yeah.
In 2019, when the median house price is $500,000, your buyer pool obviously would be pretty diverse. A lot of people from different walks of life. And when you get up close to $1 million, it probably changes the type of person that can afford to get into the suburb, right?
Definitely. And I have seen a change over the journey. I think there's more professional couples and professional sort of people with professional occupations, I guess you'd say, that are tending to move into the suburb at the moment. So particularly in some of those higher price points, they need to be close to the city for various reasons, and perhaps they're priced out of a South Perth, etc. And that Carlisle still provides great proximity to the city, and in that low 1 millions range, for example, it's well within reach for them. I've done a little bit of a snapshot on who's bought, I guess, in the last sort of 12 months from us, really, and just to get a bit of an idea. And 45% are owner-occupiers that are actually not first homeowners, so they're moving up the property chain. 27% are first home buyers. So the narrative around first home buyers is, obviously they're struggling and they don't have, but I guess the money. Yeah, but first home buyers that are coming into the suburb are often particularly people who both have high income positions and they're able to stretch to get a $900,000 million property. So there is 27% of first home buyers coming in. To say that as well, they're not all $900 million properties that are in the suburb. There's obviously duplex halves, which we touched on before. There's smaller 3x1 villas. So they might be, low to mid 800s and that type of thing. So that's right in that wheelhouse of where the scheme has been. And then there's also, I guess 28% have been investors as well. So there are investors that are floating around the suburb, yeah.
Are those investors Perth-based people, East Coast people, they're buyers agents calling you?
There's been a lot of talk about Eastern States investors and that, but I can say from my position that the price driving and the investors that are operating in Carlisle are not traditionally Eastern States investors. That's something I've seen quite clearly. And I thought all the buzz around Eastern States investors.
You're waiting for the phone call.
Yeah, I'm not so sure that they're out there as much. But I actually list outside of the area as well. And I listed one in Eden Hill, which was on around about 700 odd square metres. And I was just inundated with Eastern States investors, buyers agents and that. So clearly they were targeting different pockets. And I think Carlisle, really the price rise and the movement of the suburb has been more driven by, I feel like, owner-occupiers trying to get into the area, which has been pushing the price point up. And the investors have probably been more of a local side from what I've seen.
It's interesting. And what you've spoken to, that you've touched on the herd mentality, the swarm of East Coast buyers. They don't know what suburbs they're investing into. The buyers agents probably haven't been to it. They see a YouTube video somewhere, they see someone pop something up on a Facebook short, and then suddenly you've got 10 buyers agents from Sydney or Melbourne calling the agent in that suburb and they're thinking, Jesus, what just happened? And only because someone did some very basic analysis about a rental yield as an outcome of the median house price in the area versus the rent in that space. It's just the next suburb along that train line or that bus line that just hasn't been picked through by the locust swarm. And it's very possible it just never happened for Carlisle.
Yeah, I think that's pretty spot on. Yeah, because like I said, the Eden Hill, and I've done in other areas, I could imagine that the city of Belmont, there was just probably potentially more quote unquote value opportunities with bigger blocks. But like in Carlisle, we have had a lot of subdivision go through there. And I suppose that certainly in the higher price points of Carlisle, like even when I've been talking to sellers about coming to market, we're putting effort into presentation. So like we're trying to maximize the return, and that owner-occupiers gravitate towards those style of properties.
You touched on subdivision. 6 years ago, there was a bit of it happening. How's it going now? Do you see many building signs out and bricky teams around Star Street and Solar Way and places like that?
Yeah, it's about to happen, because even in the last probably 4 to 6 weeks in the suburb, there's been half a dozen sort of development sites that have sold. So I think that it's about to kick off again. Those development sites too, quarter acres and that, are hovering around 1.5 now, which is, if we talk about 2019.
I remember buying them off you for 750 grand back in 2019. So again, it's a doubling in that time.
Absolutely. So we were talking about that mid to high sevens, maybe we could get there. And yeah, the interesting part about the price rise and jumping up and everything like that is that the market sort of gallops along in chunks from what I've seen. So in other words, from the outside looking in, it's gone up X amount of percent over the years. But really, you have these little stretches of runs over a 3-6 month period where it really goes up in a large frame.
Have you figured out why those jumps happen?
Well, what I've seen happen is a property sale will just come out of nowhere and go large, and then all of a sudden that's the new norm. Do you know what I mean? And then what happens is people just stretch to that price and you've created a new norm. Or there'll be a big gap in between when a quarter acre site was sold and then the next quarter acre site is sold, and you would look at it on the surface, it might be, or maybe they're sitting around 1.3 and then it goes bang at 1.5 and the last sale was closer to $1 million. So
it's evidence-based essentially.
It is, but it's just, they kind of stretch up. Yeah.
That's really interesting. You also touched on the 5% scheme.
Yep.
How much of an impact did that have for you last October?
Yeah, pretty large. I even sold one out in Nollamara, which is obviously not traditionally my area. On the surface, that was high sevens, and people just went bang to 850 to try and secure it. And congrats to that buyer, because they did secure the property by doing it, and now it's probably reached that anyway. So, but yeah, locally in Carlisle, it's certainly, you just got people pushing towards 850.
So what you're saying is it just squeezed the floor up?
I would say so, yeah. And it just made people who had potentially missed out a few times just maybe go a little bit more bold and just say, look, instead of me hovering around 810, why don't I just go to 850 and try and make this happen?
Do you think it's relevant now in March 26?
So the scheme, it's still there, but the suburb of Carlisle's just probably moved past that.
And I think we've seen that story many a time where the bottom end of the suburb, which had stuff sitting there in the 700s, has within 3 months just gone bang, absorbed, moved up to 850, and now there are no longer any options in the suburb because of the scheme.
That's it.
You had your 3 months, and sorry guys, now you're going to have to move out to the next suburb.
And welcome to the new norm of that, you know what I mean? So then you mid to high eights, yeah.
You referenced some really expensive properties in Carlisle. How expensive does it get?
I've just sold one that's gone for 1.8, and that's a 500 plus square metre block. It's a substantial home. So it's basically 300 odd square metres internally. It's got a pool, but it's actually down, once again, that bottom end of the suburb. I don't like using that term, but I guess it's the slang term that's
southern
used.
end of the suburb.
Correct, yeah. But it's the slang term that's used by everyone. But essentially, that's gone for 1.8. The interesting part is that I actually referenced that property on our show in 2019. You asked me what are the high points of a sale, and that had actually gone for 850 in 2019, and then it's just now sold for, now I didn't sell it back then, but I've sold it this time, and it's just gone for 1.8. So that's probably a stark higher end of huge capital growth, but we're talking 850 to 1.8, that's nearly $1 million.
When we see that in Perth, a lot of the time when I look at the reason why, the reason is because there's a lot of house in there, and the cost of that house, you just couldn't build half of it for that anymore. Is that the reason for this one? Yeah,
and I think in this boom or rise that we've seen, not all properties are created equal. So what I mean by that is that basically what I've seen is that family homes, big, large family homes that to rebuild now would cost just out of reach for most people, but family homes on good sized blocks in Carlisle, close to the city, are just swarming with people, and their growth has just been significant compared to villas and stuff that have still had big growth. But yeah, I've seen a number of property examples of things that have just gone up over the year, which is disproportionate to the rest of the market around it. But it's normally because there's a land component attached to it, or like you said, an internal building component attached to it that's just difficult to get now.
As a reference, we did a few developments in Carlisle, but which would have finished 4 years ago, and in hindsight, you wish you kept them.
There's a few people that, yeah, hindsight's a beautiful thing. Yeah.
We were doing our fees at $550 for a brand new triplex back then.
Yep.
What will they sell for now if my clients had kept them?
If you were to sell them now, brand new, it depends on the location, but I think there's evidence to feel like they're getting 1.2 now for the resale. And then, like I said, that galloping along, that it was a bit hard or laboured to get to 1 million. But now that 1 million is not that scary number anymore, I think that push past there is going to happen a little quicker. But it really is, Carlisle's still very much location dependent to a degree. I think there's evidence to say 1.2, and depending on the finishings, could they get a little bit more?
Do you have a lot of people coming out of Lath Lane who thought, people who were looking in Lath Lane first realised they couldn't afford it and then have popped into Carlisle and gone, oh, this will do?
All the time. Yeah, so it's... But
has that always been the case though?
Yeah, Lath Lane's quite an aspirational area from people who live in Carlisle. A lot of Lath Lane's zoned R20, so the fringes of Lath Lane have a little bit of a higher density close to the roll line, but generally speaking, a lot of Lath Lane is zoned R20.
Yeah, big family homes.
Correct, yeah. So in some of the sections in Lath Lane, they're actually on 700 odd square metres and they're zoned R20. So you can't develop it. So these are aspirational family homes. It's the Australian dream. So a lot of people from Carlisle would love to get into Lath Lane like that. They get around the primary school and I guess their family journeys is off and running. What I will say though is a lot of people love living in Carlisle. There's not as many family opportunities, I suppose, as compared to Lath Lane, which has got a pocket, but it's a small pocket as well to get into.
Yeah, and I assume that you're starting in the twos for a lot of those houses.
The ones in Lath Lane, like some of them are getting to that point now. Yeah, high 1s to 2. Yeah, definitely. And because they're tightly held, once again, we're going to go back to that example of, okay, the last bit of sales evidence was like $1 million and then there's been nothing. So on the surface, it's 1.3 and then they'll go for the 1.5, referencing the quarter acre site I was talking about before. The same with this. It's a tightly held suburb in Lath Lane. So if there hasn't been a lot of sales evidence for a while, one can just really pop and then surprise. And then I guess that new normal's created.
You sell about 50 of your sales in Carlisle every year. Of those 50, why are your clients selling in the first place?
First of all, with the market and how it's tracked, I guess people have got equity and they've got options, right? People's options have opened up. A lot of the time with Carlisle, it is a transient area to a degree. So a story just plays out time again.
Well, we speak about this all the time on the podcast, that circular system of going from your starter suburb to your middle suburb to your destination suburb. Is Carlisle that middle suburb?
Yeah, but it's more about the type of property. So once again, we'll talk about that professional couple, no kids yet. They move in, 3x2 villa, so a couple of living areas and low maintenance lifestyle. You can tap into the Vic Park Cafe Strip, go to the city, then married, one child, and then the villa starts to get a little bit tight, and then all of a sudden stuff's in the garage and the second kid comes along and then they're looking to transition out of the suburb. So there's a lot of those reasons, I suppose, that like a villa is a great place for a period of time, but then sometimes the next step is obviously a bigger house and things like that. So I guess that's one. And on the flip side, there's people with the larger houses or properties that can sometimes be living up in the hills and they really want to come down, live close to the city. They want to go to the footy every second weekend. They're members of the footy and they want to be around the city and surround. So they actually transition back into villas, you know what I mean? So we'll get a lot of downsizes coming from that. That's a lot of the reasons why people are selling is just lifestyle moves. But there's been investors the property's done really well for them in the last probably 4 or 5 years in particular. So people are purchased properties in 2016, 17, maybe got it at a great price, rode a bit of a wave going down, probably thought what's happening here? And then it's obviously bounced up and then they're cashing out and doing their next move.
That median house price sitting in the 900s now.
Yes.
What are you getting for that?
Yeah, it's a bit of an awkward price point in the area now at $923,000 because most of the development sites, and to touch on, maybe if I could go back a little bit about the $505,000 when we were initially in here in 2019 and chatting about that, we were referencing a lot of if you could get a villa and obviously in 2 living areas if possible, more towards the top end of the suburb or the middle end of the suburb. And at the time I mentioned if you could get another 15 grand, there were some duplex blocks down the southern end, we'll call it the suburb, right?
And
basically
these are properties you could develop into two.
Correct,
Yep.
yeah. And now they're virtually moving up to that 1-3 category, but once again, haven't been tested. So I suppose a lot of the villas and a lot of the duplex halves have moved forward. But what it tells us is that anything that's had a bit of land component within the suburb has, and once again, land component or family home, even if it's on 500 square meters, has disproportionately grown compared to a
Units.
lower maintenance. Yeah.
All that just shows. We know this as a fundamental of property investment, and it can be shaded sometimes. It can be sullied sometimes by some times in the cycle where affordability is more of a factor, and units and apartments have a run based on affordability. But overall, over a 20-year period, for example, your larger home that has massive replacement cost consequences and your development block will outperform the unit and the apartment.
Yeah, correct. And I guess circling back to your question about what would I look to buy now if I was in 923,000, it's probably looking for that kind of property that's potentially on, can I find something on 400 square meters, 420 square meters, 450, just something with a little bit of land component. Even if the house is a little bit rough and ready, there's probably some good opportunity there still for that type of product, but they are moving up. What I will say as an example on that is I've just sold a property that was sitting on 528 square meters, just over 500. And that was a character home that 2.5 years ago sold for 575,000. And I did not sell that, but I'm selling it now. So 2.5 years later, it's gone for $1,005,000. So that's $430,000 in 2.5 years. So the market hasn't gone up like that. But I guess the case study around this is that if you can buy a property that's a little bit rough and ready on some land, right? When you go to sell, if you do aesthetic improvements, which is what was carried out here, you can actually unlock the capital appreciation within the land itself that wasn't unlocked previously.
Yeah, it puts you in the club.
Definitely. So I think that at any sort of block size over 400 square meters, even if the property is a little bit rough, I'd be probably seeing if I could get something in that range.
And I'll ask you this final question again, like I did before. If you had all the money in the world, what house would you be buying in Carlisle?
Oh, that's a great question. I think, look, I guess traditionally Western Street between Archer and Roberts has been a bit of a premier street within the suburb.
Bit of a dress circle?
Yeah, that's it. And even if it crosses over Archer and goes around Fletcher Park on Western Street, Holden Street and March Hamley, they flank Fletcher Park precinct. That's always been an area to target. But certainly anything in the top end with some development potential, yeah, I'd be looking at that for sure.
Is it true, as a bonus question, that less attractive areas can gentrify and change their stripes over time, but good streets always stay good streets?
Yeah, that's a fair point. In my time, Western Street's always stayed like a premier street. O'Day Street, which is close to that, have always maintained their kind of identity. Yeah, and then other parts of the suburb can gentrify and grow over time. But yeah, good streets tend to stay that way. Yeah.
Matthew Jones, #1 agent for 11 years running in Carlisle. Congratulations, mate. And you are such an expert. It's just so easy to talk to you about this suburb and the topic that you're clearly passionate about. Keep smashing on, and hopefully we're talking to you about 100 properties sold next year.
I appreciate it, Trent. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Perth Property Show. If you've only just joined the conversation, you can catch up by heading over to our website, perthpropertyshow.com.au, subscribing to the podcast, or joining our Facebook page. Don't forget to tune in next Monday at 7 a.m. for more expert insights, local analysis, and suburb spotlights. Happy hunting!